There is an ancient wisdom that echoes through time, whispering in our ears that happiness is not a destination but a journey. A journey that begins not when we find what we seek, but when we embrace what life presents to us. Our story begins in a thriving port city, where the sound of waves intertwined with the voices of merchants, and where fate was about to impart one of its deepest lessons. The merchant stood gazing at the horizon, his hands still smelling of salt and burnt wood. The ship that carried all his fortune had sunk into the ocean's depths during an unexpected storm. The flames that consumed his home still danced in his memory, and the silence left by his absent family echoed in his ears. Everything he had built over decades had turned to ashes and sea foam in a matter of days. As he wandered aimlessly, his feet led into an ancient fig tree on the outskirts of the city. Its roots, as old as time itself, seemed to embrace the earth with the same strength that his memories clung to him. It was there, exhausted and devastated, that he sat, his back resting against the rough trunk of the tree, which would be his only companion that night. The wind blew gently through the leaves, creating a dance of shadows on the ground. An old monk, who often meditated at that spot, observed the merchant for a long moment before approaching. Without uttering a word, the monk sat beside him and began to gaze at the night sky. The clouds drifted slowly, constantly shifting their forms. At times, they resembled majestic dragons. At others, simple tufts of cotton. Finally, the monk broke the silence, his voice as soft as the night breeze. Observe the clouds. They teach us one of life's most valuable lessons. The merchant, initially reluctant to engage in any conversation, found himself inevitably drawn in by the serenity of the moment. The monk continued, "Every cloud we see is unique, magnificent in its form. But try to grasp it, and you'll realize there is nothing solid to hold on to. Life is the same, a constant dance of formation and dissolution." The words struck deep in the merchant's heart. As he watched the clouds transform, he began to see his own life reflected in that celestial dance. His ship, his house, his family, they were like the clouds, present one moment, transformed the next. The monk then shared an ancient teaching. Just as a river is never the same when we touch its waters twice, our lives are in constant flux. The true cause of suffering is not change itself, but our resistance to it. Every attempt to freeze a moment, to keep things exactly as they are, is like trying to hold water in open hands. As the night wore on, the merchant began to realize that his losses, as painful as they were part of life's natural flow. His wealth was no different from the clouds they watched, temporary, ever-changing. For the first time since the storm, he felt his chest grow lighter, as if he were beginning to release a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. The stars shone brightly as the monk finally rose to his feet. Before leaving, he offered one last teaching. True happiness doesn't come from having everything we desire, but from being able to dance with life's changes. Every loss is a door opening to something new. Every ending is the beginning of a new journey. The merchant remained under the fig tree, his heart starting to open to a deeper understanding. The tears that now ran down his face were no longer just of sorrow, but of an emerging acceptance. As the night gave way, he realized that perhaps, just perhaps, his true journey was only beginning. With the first rays of sunlight touching his face, he rose, his bare feet feeling the cold earth beneath them. A new day was dawning, and with it, a newfound understanding that life flows on, like an eternal river, bringing and taking away in its infinite cycle of transformation. The merchant walked along the dusty road, his feet already calloused from the miles traveled since that night beneath the fig tree. The morning sun was still gentle, its first rays painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. In his mind, the old monk's words about impermanence still echoed, but the universe was about to teach him a new lesson about the nature of happiness. It was then he heard a groan coming from behind some bushes by the roadside. Approaching cautiously, he found an injured man, blood trickling from a deep wound in his leg. The man's face was smeared with dirt and sweat, but the merchant immediately recognized him. It was the thief who, just 3 nights ago, had stolen his last pouch of coins while he slept under a tree. His first impulse was vengeance. Here lay the man who had taken his last possessions, now completely vulnerable. A voice within whispered that this was karma, that he should simply continue on his way and let fate take its course. After all, wasn't this exactly what the thief deserved? But as he looked at the injured man, something strange began to stir in his heart. He saw in the thief's eyes the same fear and despair he had felt when he lost everything. The man trembled, not just from pain but from terror, recognizing his former victim. He expected punishment, perhaps even death. The merchant sat down beside the thief and, without saying a word, tore a piece from his own tunic, one of the few belongings he still had. Carefully, he began to clean the wound. The thief, confused, tried to pull away, but the pain left him motionless. "Why?" the thief asked, his voice trembling. "Why are you helping me after what I did?" The merchant continued his work in silence for a few moments, recalling the clouds he had watched with the monk. "You know," he began, "just a few days ago, I thought happiness lay in the things I owned. In the goods on my ship, the gold in my chests, the jewels I kept at home. I lost all of it to the sea and the fire, and I thought my happiness had vanished along with it." As he spoke, his hands skillfully improvised a bandage using strips of fabric. "When you took my last coins, I thought I'd lost my final connection to my old life. But now I see you helped me understand something important." The thief looked at him with a mix of shame and curiosity. The merchant continued, "Every person we meet carries their own story of suffering. You didn't steal because you're evil, but because you're trapped in your own cycle of need and fear. By helping you now, I'm freeing not just your suffering, but my own." Tears began to stream down the thief's dirt-streaked face. In all his years of stealing and running, no one had ever shown him such kindness. The merchant finished tying the bandage and helped the man sit more comfortably. "True wealth," said the merchant, now fully understanding his words, "is not in what we possess, but in our ability to feel another's suffering and act to relieve it. That is where we find a happiness that no one can steal." Together, they shared water and the small amount of food the merchant carried. The thief, moved by the compassion he had received, began to share his own story of loss and hardship. The sun was already high in the sky when they finally parted ways, both transformed by the encounter. The merchant continued on his journey, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced since before the storm that took his ship. He realized that compassion was like an inexhaustible spring within him. The more he gave, the more he had to offer. His happiness no longer depended on external circumstances but sprang from his ability to see beyond appearances and connect with others' suffering. The road ahead wound through the hills, and though he didn't know where it would lead, he knew he had found something more valuable than all the goods he had ever traded. In his heart, the seed of compassion had begun to bloom, turning each step of his journey into an opportunity for growth and deeper understanding. The sun was setting when the merchant arrived at the gates of a small village. His encounter with the thief had fundamentally changed something within his heart, but his stomach still cried out for food. He had shared his lost provisions with the injured man, and now had nothing but a small wooden bowl he had found along the way. The village was in the midst of some kind of festival. Colorful lanterns hung between the houses, and the aroma of food filled the air, making his stomach rumble even louder. In the past, he might have been an honored guest at such celebrations, perhaps even a sponsor. Now, he was about to do something he had never imagined: beg for food. Holding the bowl with trembling hands, he approached the first house. His clothes, once fine, were now dirty and tattered from days of walking. Before he could knock on the door, He heard raised voices coming from inside, a family arguing about money. He hesitated. In his mind, he had envisioned being received with kindness, his bowl being filled with generosity. But the reality of the argument he overheard made him step back. He moved on to the next house, creating a new expectation in his mind. Perhaps someone more prosperous lived here, someone who could not only feed him but even offer him work. The door opened, revealing an elderly woman who, upon seeing him, quickly shut the door, muttering something about thieves and vagrants. The rejection stung, but not as much as he had expected. Something about the lessons he had learned earlier was beginning to make sense. Each expectation he created was like building a small prison for his happiness. The woman wasn't cruel. She was simply acting out of her own fears and experiences. House after house, his bowl remained empty. Some people ignored him, others apologized for not having enough to share, and a few offered small portions of food. What struck him was that his happiness was starting to detach from the outcome of each attempt. Then he came across a group of children playing in the street. One of them, noticing his empty bowl, ran home and returned with a small piece of bread. Her eyes sparkled with the joy of being able to help. The merchant accepted the gift with deep gratitude, but before he could eat, he noticed a thin, hungry dog watching him from a distance. Without a second thought, he shared half of the bread with the animal. The children, amazed by his gesture, ran to their homes and came back with more food, small portions their families could spare. Soon, his bowl was full, not only with food, but with a precious lesson. Sitting on a small stone bench in the village square, savoring every bite of the food he had received, the merchant reflected on how his expectations had always colored his experience of the world. When he was wealthy, he had expected to be treated with deference and respect, and any different treatment disturbed him. When he began to beg, he expected rejection and pity, and each small act of kindness surprised him. True freedom, he realized, lay in letting go of all expectations. Each moment became new and precious when it was not tainted by his projections of what should be. Happiness was not in receiving what he expected, but in being open to what life offered. That night, he slept under the stars, his bowl empty beside him. Yet his heart was fuller than it had ever been during his days of wealth. Every person he had met, every rejection, every small act of kindness, each had been a teacher. The sleeping village around him was no different from the ocean that had taken his goods. Unpredictable, sometimes cruel, sometimes generous, but always offering exactly what he needed to learn. Before falling asleep, he looked at his bowl under the moonlight. Empty once again. It was no different from his own mind, ready to receive whatever the next day would bring, without expectations, without demands. And in that acceptance, he found a peace no wealth could ever buy. At dawn, the merchant found himself walking away from the village, his empty bowl swaying gently at his side. The distant sound of bells caught his attention. A modest temple stood atop a nearby hill, its red-tiled roof glowing under the golden morning light. Almost instinctively, his steps carried him there. The temple was humble, but its gardens were extraordinary. As he climbed the weathered stone steps, he noticed an elderly monk hunched over a small flower bed, carefully pulling out weeds with deliberate, precise movements. The monk did not look up from his work, but his voice was clear. "You seem to carry a long journey on your shoulders." The merchant stopped, surprised not only by the words, but by how they seemed to resonate deeply within him. "I have traveled far," he replied, "and I've learned much along the way about impermanence beneath a fig tree, about compassion from a wounded thief, and about detachment in the streets of a village. Yet I feel there is still something I'm missing." At last, the monk raised his eyes, a kind smile softening his wrinkled face. "Perhaps," he said, picking up a small trowel, "you need to learn the art of being truly present." He held the tool out to the merchant. "The garden needs tending. Start with this flower bed." The merchant took the trowel, remembering the days when he commanded dozens of workers. Now, here he was, about to work in a garden. Kneeling beside the flower bed, he began to pull weeds, his mind wandering between memories of the past and worries about the future. "Stop," the monk said gently. "You are not here. Feel the soil beneath your fingers. Listen to the sound the roots make as they come free. Notice how each weed is unique. This moment, exactly as it is all we have." The merchant tried again, this time focusing on the details he had overlooked before. He felt the texture of the damp earth, noticed how some roots resisted more than others, and observed the tiny insects scurrying for cover as he disturbed their world. The sun warmed his back, a gentle breeze brushed his face, and birdsong filled the air. Everything felt more vivid, more real. Hours passed without his noticing. The monk worked silently beside him, and together they moved steadily through the garden. When the sun was high in the sky, the monk offered him fresh water and a simple piece of bread. "When we eat," the monk instructed, "we only eat. When we drink, we only drink." The merchant took a bite of the bread, surprised by how much flavor it held when his full attention was on the experience. "All my life," the merchant reflected, "I've been rushing to the next moment, the next deal, the next achievement. Even after losing everything, I kept running, this time chasing answers, understanding." The monk nodded. "And now you are beginning to understand that life can only be lived in the present moment. The past is gone, like the clouds you watched with my brother beneath the fig tree. The future has not yet come, like the garden we will plant tomorrow. All we have is this moment." In the afternoon, they continued their work. Every stroke of the trowel, every weed pulled, every drop of sweat became a meditation. The merchant discovered that when he was fully present, happiness arose naturally, not as an overwhelming emotion, but as a deep, steady peace. As the sun began to set, the monk led him to a small room at the back of the temple. "Stay as long as you need," he said. "The garden is a patient teacher." Lying on his simple mattress that night, the merchant realized that, for the first time in a long while, he was neither anxious about tomorrow nor trapped in memories of the past. He was simply present, aware of the air flowing in and out of his lungs, the distant sound of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves in the garden. And in that simplicity, in that total presence in the moment, he found a happiness that did not depend on external circumstances, a happiness that was always available, waiting only for him to be truly present to experience it. Days at the temple turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The merchant had found a natural rhythm between working in the garden and moments of quiet contemplation. His mind, once restless like a stormy sea, began to settle. It was then that he noticed something remarkable. Pilgrims and traders often stopped at the temple seeking advice and guidance. One particularly hot afternoon, while watering the plants, he heard raised voices coming from the main gate. A young merchant, tears in his eyes, was arguing with his assistants. The scene was painfully familiar. This man had lost a valuable shipment to roadside thieves, and his partners were abandoning him. The merchant set down his watering can. For a moment, all his old pain resurfaced. The memory of the sinking ship, the burned house, the absence of his family. But this time, something was different. The pain was there, but it did not consume him. It was like watching dark clouds pass across the sky without being drenched by the rain. He approached the group, his hands still dirty from the soil. "May I help?" he asked simply. The young merchant looked at him with initial suspicion, but something in his calm presence compelled him to speak. As he listened, the merchant realized he could clearly see the mistakes the young man had made, the same mistakes he himself had made in the past. The route chosen, the misplaced trust, the lack of basic precautions. His own past suffering had turned into practical wisdom that could now benefit others. "You know," he began, guiding the young man to a bench beneath a blossoming cherry tree. "There was a time when I was one of the greatest merchants on this side of the sea." He shared his story, no longer as a tragedy, but as a valuable lesson. Every loss, every moment of despair had become a precious teaching. The young merchant listened intently, his eyes widening as he realized he was receiving advice from someone who had navigated far rougher waters than his own. "How can I rebuild?" he finally asked. In the days that followed, more merchants began arriving at the temple, seeking the guidance of the merchant monk, as some called him, though he never donned the robes. The old monk in the garden watched with a quiet smile as his student turned a corner of the temple into a space for teaching and counseling. The merchant found that every piece of advice he gave, every story he shared, every solution he helped uncover, not only aided others, but also healed something within himself. His past suffering had become a gift, the ability to deeply understand the pain of others and help them find their way through it. One evening, sitting in his small room and reflecting on the transformations in his life, he grasped a profound truth. Suffering was not an obstacle to be avoided, but a teacher to be honored. Like the mud that nourished the roots of the lotus flowers in the temple's pond, his pain had become the fertile ground from which his ability to help others had grown. He picked up his old begging bowl, now used to hold seeds for the garden. Every scratch, every mark on its surface told a story of transformation. The bowl was no longer a symbol of loss and need, but a reminder of how each experience could be turned into something meaningful. The old monk found him in this moment of contemplation and sat beside him. "You have realized," he said softly, "that our deepest happiness often grows from the soil of our greatest suffering." The merchant nodded, finally understanding that every step of his journey, the night under the fig tree, the encounter with the thief, the experiences in the village, the work in the garden, had been necessary to bring forth this truth. His suffering had not merely disappeared. It had transformed into something precious, something that could illuminate the path for others. True alchemy, the monk said, is not turning lead into gold, but transforming our pain into wisdom, our suffering into compassion. In this, you have become a master. One morning, a year after arriving at the temple, the merchant felt a calling to return to the shore where his journey had begun. The old garden monk merely smiled when the merchant shared his plans, as if he had always known this moment would come. "Before you leave," the monk said, "take one last look at this garden we've tended together." The merchant gazed around, noticing how every plant, every flower, and every small being thrived in perfect harmony with one another. The bees pollinated the flowers nourished the bees. The rain fed the soil sustained the trees, and the trees protected the earth. With his begging bowl hanging at his waist, a symbol of his transformation, he began the long walk to the coast. The path led him through the village where he had learned about letting go, past the spot where he had encountered the wounded thief, and finally to the old fig tree where his true journey had begun. When he reached the shore, the sun was setting, painting the sky with the same colors he had seen on the day of the shipwreck. But now, everything felt different. The waves that had claimed his ship no longer seemed cruel, and the wind that had fueled the flames of his home no longer felt like an enemy. Sitting on the sand, he realized how every moment of his journey was connected to all the others. If the ship had not sunk, he would never have met the monk under the fig tree. If he had not lost his last coins to the thief, he would never have discovered the true nature of compassion. Every loss had been a hidden gift, every hardship a teacher in humble disguise. A group of merchants passed by, carrying goods to a nearby ship. In their faces, he saw the same anxiety that had once consumed him. One of them recognized him from the temple days and approached him with a bow. "Master," said the merchant, "your teaching saved my business and changed my life. Please, accept this gift." He offered a bag of gold coins. The merchant smiled gently and declined the gold. "The true gift," he said, is understanding that everything is connected. Your gratitude is reward enough, for it also teaches and transforms me. At that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he grasped the ultimate truth of his journey. True happiness is not a state to be achieved, but a way of seeing life in its entirety. Every moment, every encounter, every experience, they all form part of an infinite web of connections. Happiness is not found in the absence of difficulties, but in our ability to remain present and grateful through all of life's changes. As the merchant had discovered, through impermanence, we learn to let go. Through compassion, we discover our shared humanity. Through detachment, we find true freedom. Through presence, we uncover peace in every moment. Through transformed suffering, we gain wisdom. And through interdependence, we find gratitude for all things. The merchant never returned to his old life of material wealth. Instead, he continued traveling from port to port, temple to temple, sharing his story with those who needed to hear it. His begging bowl, once a symbol of loss, became a reminder that true wealth lies not in what we own, but in our ability to remain content in every situation, finding gratitude even in life's most challenging moments. And so, his story became a beacon of hope for others, showing that our circumstances do not determine our happiness, but rather our ability to see the beauty and interconnection in every moment of life, whether it be of gain or loss, joy or pain. For in the end, as the merchant discovered, everything is a teacher, everything is a path, and in every moment lies the possibility of awakening to a deeper, truer happiness.